Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Balancing Work and Cancer webinar, Newly Diagnosed, Getting Started. We will take questions following the presentation. You may submit a question throughout the webinar using the question box located on the lower left-hand side of your screen. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Nicole Jarvis. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jess. Hello, and thank you all for attending today. As mentioned, I'm Nicole Jarvis, Senior Manager of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I'll be your presenter for today's webinar, Newly Diagnosed, Getting Started. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items related to accreditation. Today's webinar is accredited for CEUs by ANCC, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society for Human Resource Management. Please note, today's webinar is not accredited by NASW. If you plan on receiving continuing education credit for this program, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must call in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, as well as receive a passing grade on the post-test. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all of this information, and it will be sent by 5 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, and certificates will be emailed within 4 to 6 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters for this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. The lead sponsor for Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series is Genentech. In addition, Cancer and Careers year-round sponsors support all of CAC's core programs, including this one. Thanks to their support, Cancer and Careers has created the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series to provide patients, survivors, and healthcare professionals with concise, targeted information to help you understand a variety of issues that surround balancing work and cancer. Before we get started, I do just quickly want to highlight the programs and services Cancer and Careers offers. As the only program in the U.S. solely focused on work and cancer, our support and services include a comprehensive website with tons of information, which is also available in Spanish. We have free publications available in English and Spanish. We offer career coaching as well as educational webinars like today. We also offer in-person events in more normal times, so community-based events as well as larger conferences, such as our national conference, which takes place every June in New York City, and 2 regional conferences, one in LA and one in Chicago. We've transitioned many of our in-person events to be held virtually, so be sure to check out our upcoming events page in order to learn more about those. So as you know, the title for today's presentation is Newly Diagnosed, Getting Started. And I'm guessing that while many of you on this call chose to be here because you consider yourself to be newly diagnosed, we do know that that phrase can mean different things to different people. Some of you may have been diagnosed just a few days ago, so are perhaps still trying to wrap your heads around everything. Some of you may have started treatment and have already made choices about how to move forward in regards to your job, while others might be facing a recurrence and looking for new approaches to balancing work and treatment this time around. Or maybe you're in a different place than the ones I've mentioned. Regardless of where you are in your journey, we hope you'll leave here today with some new helpful information that's relevant to you and can help you determine the best path forward. I also want to acknowledge that while there is guidance throughout this presentation for people who are either working or looking for work, we really leaned into the part of our conversation focused on those trying to balance an existing job with a diagnosis. For those of you actively looking for work, I encourage you to check out our many job search specific programs and resources in addition to the information that I present to you today. So before we jump into exploring the various work concerns that often present themselves early on in a cancer journey and the potential approaches to managing them, I'd like to quickly talk about some common misconceptions about cancer and work, which we hear often from people are encountering, and they can feel particularly daunting. Misconceptions such as people diagnosed with the cancer don't want to work, people diagnosed with cancer can't work, or people balancing work and cancer will not be as productive. What's important to remember when thinking about work is that it's often about much more than a paycheck and benefits, which of course are important, but there's an identity piece to it that shouldn't be overlooked. Many people take pride in their jobs and employment and get satisfaction from working regardless of the industry or role because, understandably, work is a part of who they are. So this idea that cancer takes away the ability or the desire to work is often very false. We list these here to highlight the range of misconceptions around a cancer diagnosis as it relates to work, and we'll be discussing strategies and tools to help you understand how to approach your situation in order to make informed decisions about whether, if, or how to work during all or part of your treatment. From here, we jump right to the heart of this work and cancer conversation, and that's the diagnosis and work dilemma. For many people, the question of how work factors in, or whether it factors in at all, become really important. And it can be quite challenging to look at the big picture when you're also focused on addressing a health crisis, because all of the unknowns can feel understandably overwhelming. It's important in these moments to acknowledge the reality of what's going on, and from there to start to isolate and answer some specific questions in order to illuminate the best path forward for you. So what are the questions you should consider asking yourself in order to make the best decisions about balancing work and cancer? Often a good place to start is by spending some time considering what your wants are versus your needs. They tend to vary from person to person, and when people start to list out their wants and needs, they sometimes find they aren't in alignment with one another, and that's okay. The idea here is to take a step back and start evaluating the individual parts within the bigger picture to figure out what's true for you. So, for example, what are your financial and insurance needs? For some people, those are going to be key in driving decisions about whether or not to work during treatment. But for others, that's not the case. So also asking yourself, how is your identity connected to your job? Maybe you love what you do and want to make sure you're able to continue doing it because it's going to help you cope during treatment. Again, this isn't going to be the case for everybody, but the point is to have a sense of how that comes into play for you. And of course, no person is only their job and their diagnosis. So what might you want to consider in terms of your personal life? Do you have obligation to family or other loved ones that needs to be prioritized? What do you think you might need in terms of self-care for yourself? You may also find that once you start asking yourself these questions, more questions start to come up for you that you don't know how to answer by yourself. And again, that's okay. We're going to talk about more about that shortly. It's also completely understandable if this part of the process is starting to feel a little bit overwhelming. So you may be experiencing some strong emotions related to receiving the news of your diagnosis. This news can bring about a range of feelings from shock, stress, anxiety, depression, numbness, even feelings of urgency to quote-unquote get things moving. Regardless of what's going on with you emotionally, it's important for you to know that your feelings are valid and there's no right reaction. Allowing yourself to feel these emotions can be a really important part of preparing to make such huge decisions. First things first, taking a beat can be really helpful to get yourself centered and focused on what you need to do next. And giving yourself the space to breathe and process can make the next steps feel just a little bit more manageable. Over the next few slides, we're going to discuss what it looks like to gather information, get organized to better understand what your options are, and to make an action plan for moving forward with treatments, surgery, medical interventions, and how work might fit into these factors. I do want to acknowledge, however, that sometimes decisions do need to be made rather quickly due to specific circumstances, so it may not always be possible to apply this exact process to every single decision you make. And again, that's okay. What we're trying to do here is to offer you some tips and tools that can help with making these decisions and planning for the future. So the next step in the process is gathering information, and this can help guide your decisions. To simplify this process a bit, we've broken down the types of information into 3 categories or buckets, which you can see laid out here: medical and treatment information, work information, and legal information. Over the next 2 slides, we'll take a deeper dive into each to understand what specifically falls into each of these 3 categories. The place to start when it comes to gathering information for medical and treatment information is your medical team. Ask questions about the timeline for surgery and any other treatment protocols like chemo or radiation, as well as potential side effects from them. This can help you start to figure out whether or not it will be possible for you to work during all or part of treatment. Also, it's important for you to be open with your healthcare team about the specifics of what your job entails day to day, including concerns you may have about them, as well as what your work-related goals are so that they can help you develop a plan for balancing work and cancer that works for what you want as well. For example, Taking a proactive approach to making sure your chemo treatments are scheduled in a way that lines up with your needs and commitments at work can help you to feel like a more active participant in your care. An example of this might be that your doctor says they want to see you in 2 weeks and the scheduler says you can come in on a Thursday morning, but you know you have a set meeting with your team on Thursday morning that's really important for you to participate in. So it's worth asking if Wednesday or Friday would work instead. This may not always be possible, but remember, asking can't hurt and it can relieve you of some of those internal pressures and stresses. So as we move into our conversation about gathering information regarding work itself, I want to flag that it may not be applicable for those of you not currently employed, but it may be useful down the line when you do find yourself working again. This part of the process can help you to start thinking about how you can manage your treatment protocol with the way that your company works and the duties of your specific job. This part of the process, for instance, researching your workplace's existing policies and flexibilities can lend insight into how to devise a plan should you decide to continue working during treatment. Alternatively, learning about your company's leave policies can help determine your ability to take time off in either large or small chunks of time. Much of the information you're looking for may be accessible through an online employee portal or in a handbook that you can locate and look through on your own. Or you may prefer to have a conversation with a person in order to get your hands on a copy of the employee handbook or have your questions answered, whatever works for you. Also, if you've been at a company for a while and have seen coworkers experiencing personal challenges, think back to how they were handled, both the good and bad aspects, and consider how that might color your situation and your experience. And if you have a close enough relationship to them, perhaps consider talking to them about how the company responded to them and what steps they had to take. As we move into our conversation about gathering legal information, I do want to mention that since I am a social worker and the law is not my area of training or licensure, if you have specific questions about your situation, I definitely encourage you to reach out to an attorney. However, the law plays a very important role in thinking about and talking about work and cancer, which is why I include it. Understandably, it can be kind of scary to start thinking about the law and our jobs. So I want to stress that we don't talk about this topic because we think it's likely that an employment situation will become litigious, but rather because legal and practical issues do not exist in separate vacuums. Often, when there's a practical concern, there is a legal piece to it as well. And for many people, the law becomes a key tool for helping them pull together a plan for working through treatment if they qualify for protections. So again, if you're interested in learning more about which federal or state workplace laws and protections may or may not be available to you, I encourage you to reach out to a legal expert. And you can also find more broad, reliable information about laws on various government websites, as well as educational blogs and resources. I've shared some resources at the end of the presentation for that purpose. Now, with all of that said, for the purposes of today, I do want to focus on one key law in order to help provide a foundation for any additional fact-finding that may be necessary. This law is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. To start, the ADA is a federal law, meaning it applies in all 50 states. The part that's relevant to work in cancer comes from Title I, and like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met to use it. In broad strokes, these requirements are that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills and certifications in order to do the job. And finally, your disability must meet the criteria as determined by the ADA. If you meet all of these requirements, the ADA protects you from discrimination and may also provide access to reasonable accommodations, which we will discuss later in this presentation. Again, this is just a quick overview, so you know that the ADA is something to consider, and I want to encourage you to speak with a legal professional to determine if you are eligible to use these ADA protections. So, once you've gathered all of your information, getting and staying organized is the next step. In general, being organized makes life easier, and it removes some of that chaos that we all naturally face in our lives. But after receiving a cancer diagnosis, staying organized can be extremely helpful and may even have a positive impact both physically and emotionally. Staying organized can aid in the various decisions you may need to make, including the decision of whether or not to work. It can help you feel a sense of control during the more overwhelming moments. It can help decrease work-related stress. And it can also allow you to be better prepared for any potential hiccups or issues that could arise along the way. So let's break down some of the best practices for getting and staying organized. Now, keeping all of your paperwork and documents in one place may seem like a simple thing, but it can make a really big difference. Whether you're a fan of digital files or you preferred hard copies, having a centralized storage spot can reduce the headache of constantly searching for important details that might be necessary to make appointments or communicate with your insurance company. It's also the case that during your initial information gathering, you may come across pieces of information that aren't relevant today, but they could be useful down the line. So having all of your information stored in the same place means you'll know where to look for it when the time comes. Next, take notes during your appointments. Again, you may prefer to use a notebook that you can write in or your smartphone or tablet. Also, our Living and Working with Cancer workbook has a great notes section in it that can help you to also keep track of things. Recording may be an option as well if that's okay with the person that you're speaking with. But really the bottom line here is these are all tools that can be used so you don't have to rely solely on your memory. If you feel comfortable doing so, bring a friend or family member to appointments. Though you may prefer to attend appointments and treatment alone, and that's entirely a personal decision, if you are open to having someone from your support network join you, they can act as another recording device and perhaps catch things you may have missed or forgotten in your conversations with your doctors. Additionally, having someone to keep you company can also help to keep your spirits up and distract you. Write everything down so you have a record to refer back to, whether these are questions, concerns, or observations to discuss during future medical appointments, keeping track of questions that might arise outside of appointment times, concerns regarding treatment or side effects, or certain observations you've made during or after treatment. These can all allow for a more involved process where you're able to be, again, an active participant in your treatment plan. In this notebook, it can also be helpful to write down ideas and scripts for future workplace conversations, such as phone calls or project updates. It's a place to keep track of those involved in your care or employment conversations you've had. And also just a place to jot down any tips that are given to you from others in the cancer community. Overall, taking the time to prepare and get organized in days when you have more energy can really pay off on those days that you find that you have less. Now that you've put in the time and work of identifying information and getting yourself organized, it's time to make a decision about whether or not to work. To do this, review the information you've gathered and think through how it might be applied in alternative scenarios. Talk through some of the pros and cons of your options with those close to you who understand your circumstances, as they can provide different perspectives which can highlight aspects that you yourself may not have considered. And remember, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation where you're either working through all of treatment or not working at all. For plenty of survivors, strategically taking shorter periods of time off, whether that means 2 weeks to recover from surgery or a few days here and there for chemo appointments, is what allows them to continue to stay actively engaged in their work. I also want to mention that if you're looking for work when you receive a diagnosis, you can also think about what it would look like to get a job during this stage and what your considerations would need to be in order to make a decision around working or not there. So let's talk a little bit about creating an actual plan for yourself. As I've mentioned throughout, after receiving a cancer diagnosis and throughout treatment, people could feel like things are suddenly out of their control. But creating an action plan, to the extent that it is possible, can help you to empower yourself and maybe even regain a sense of control over your circumstances. Here we have laid out the elements of a successful action plan. The first is that it addresses your unique needs and goals in terms of treatment, work, your personal and family life, and so on. It's also key that there's some sense of priority given to the items on your plan. So with that said, it's important to remember that the treatment experience can be fluid. It's possible things may change. And while the plan that you outline may seem airtight today, it may have to be modified over time as things evolve. So it's important to stay flexible and communicate appropriately at work, which I will talk a little bit more about workplace communications in a bit. Additionally, when we think about a successful action plan in the context of work, it also incorporates your employer's needs as well as your own. This is not to say that your employer's needs should be put above yours or that there's no room to negotiate how work gets done, but it's important to make sure that these get woven into your thinking as well. Another critical component is identifying the places where others might be able to pitch in. Now, for some, asking for help can be a real challenge, but when and where you feel comfortable doing so, asking for help can alleviate some of the stress and worries that may be weighing you down. In a work context, this may mean sitting down with your manager or supervisor so that you can think through together how coworkers might be able to help out. And finally, as we've discussed, there's a benefit to having things written down, and the same is true here. In fact, a practice we often encourage is keeping a work diary, which can be a useful tool in helping you to evolve your action plan based on your needs and as things might begin to change. So let's talk about some approaches to making a work and cancer diary work for you. First, it can help you map out an overview of what treatment is likely to look like in both the short and longer term. By collecting important treatment-related dates, such as for surgery, chemo, etc., and the information that is available to you about potential recovery time, side effects, etc., you can then compare to your work calendar and see where there might be any issues or conflicts in terms of scheduling. Of course, there may be certain appointments and treatments that are date-specific, so they need to take priority over work deadlines. But it can be worth talking with your healthcare team to see where there is certain flexibility. As we've discussed, your schedule is an area where there's opportunity for you to be an active participant and advocate for your needs, and really ultimately feel more in control of the process. Now, once you've started to lay out the broad overview of treatment as a whole, you can start to map out what each individual work week might look like, and keep notes on your experiences of how the weeks are actually playing out as you're going along. Tracking how you feel at certain times of the day, what side effects you're experiencing, if and how you were able to identify any ways to mitigate symptoms. All of these can help reveal important patterns which you can then work with strategically. So for example, this might mean planning to eat at specific intervals throughout the workday to combat nausea, or creating a schedule of breaks that aligns with when you've noticed you're experiencing the strongest bouts of fatigue so that you're able to maximize the time of day you're able to best focus. Once you have a reliable log, you can also use it to begin brainstorming job modifications that could address your needs. And in cases where you might want to formally request reasonable accommodations, you can use those notes to plan out and drive those conversations with your employer. So while we're on the topic of modifications at work, I do want to return to the ADA. As I mentioned earlier, one of the potential benefits that is available through the ADA for those who qualify is access to what are called reasonable accommodations. So let's talk a little bit about what they are. Reasonable accommodations are modifications to your job, your schedule, or the work environment that you work in that makes it possible for you to perform the essential duties of your job. On this slide, you'll see a few resources that delve a little deeper into reasonable accommodations and how to request them. But for now, let's talk a little bit more about how you can identify those potential accommodations for yourself. So there's a number of questions you can ask yourself to help identify other potential accommodations. So for example, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? So this would mean you ultimately work the same number of hours, they're just distributed differently. Varying the start and end times of the workday to maximize the hours that you're feeling best can be a huge help. So a 9-to-5 day might become a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. day. Or can you maybe take time out during the workday to go to appointments and make the time up by working later that day or later in the week? Again, this may not work for every kind of job, but could be a really great solution for people who do project-based work. Next, can you work from home part-time or full-time? Similar to changing work hours, this might not work for every type of job, in particular those who might need to be customer or client-facing, but it is becoming more and more commonplace. So it's possible there may already be a policy about this in your employee handbook, and if not, perhaps one could be created. Also, with everything going on with the pandemic, it's becoming much more common to see people working remotely and for companies to understand that this is a possibility. So among other things, this can eliminate a draining commute and reserve energy to work if that's something that's posing a problem for you. Another question to ask is if your job includes allocated break times. Is it possible for you to take more frequent or additional breaks? So let's say your schedule entitles you to 2 breaks and a 45-minute lunch, but what you really need is a total of 4 breaks in your day. Those extra breaks could potentially be considered an accommodation. Or maybe for you, it's about getting access to special equipment. One survivor we spoke to mentioned that for her, glare and text on screens is challenging based on some of the side effects left over from her treatment, and so she requested a large screen and text magnification as a reasonable accommodation. Another possibility might be to have certain tasks or projects moved from your job. Years ago, Cancer and Careers met a school teacher who was suffering from fatigue, but obviously couldn't telecommute to his job because he needed to be in the classroom teaching his required subjects for a specific number of hours per day. But part of his job was lunch and recess duty. So the school worked out an accommodation for him to have a coworker take over lunch and recess duty, which allowed him to rest during these periods and catch up on some work. Again, these examples are meant to help you to start thinking about accommodations and also remove some of the myths around the concept, such as accommodations are expensive or unlikely to be approved. The fact is that according to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost the employer $500 or less, and many cost nothing. So be resourceful and really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges that you're experiencing. And once again, remember, it's all fluid. So what would make work easier today might be different tomorrow, and this isn't a one-time only opportunity. So moving back to this concept of the work and cancer diary, many people also find them useful in thinking through optimal times for treatment. Look back over your notes about prior treatments to identify any patterns you notice, and then use that information to schedule your appointment at times that would be conducive to your work schedule and energy levels. So for example, if you feel exhausted 3 or 4 hours after treatment, consider maybe scheduling 2 p.m. appointments so you'll be off work when that fatigue really starts to hit. Or maybe schedule sessions for Friday afternoons if your body needs a few days to recover from treatment. Additionally, keeping a detailed written record of your day-to-day activities at work can prove beneficial on a number of levels. So this may include a description of your projects, the associated tasks, and what has been done, as well as a to-do list with next steps. Keeping notes in this way can help you stay organized and effectively manage your time as you move through your days. It also creates a log of the tasks that you've accomplished the day or week or month before. And this can be really helpful if and when chemo brain or fatigue starts to impact your memory or your ability to focus. Additionally, tracking hours and assignments could prove valuable if a worst-case scenario arises at work and you start to suspect that there may be some discrimination taking place. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we don't bring this up because we think it's likely to happen. But unfortunately, we do know that some people do run into problems at their workplace. And in those instances, having a detailed account of your time and accomplishments can prove very valuable. And finally, as this last bullet suggests, your work and cancer diary can be a really great place for you to start to draft and revise your disclosure plan. So whether or not to disclose at work or in other areas of your life is an incredibly personal decision and one that requires a lot of thought. What's important to know and remember here is that you are not required or obligated to share your health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. A lot of individuals with cancer often confuse omitting with lying, but it's personal information and it's not necessary to share any or all personal information with your employer. It can often come down to how you feel about sharing. Also, consider why you want to share. Is it because you feel you want to do it? Do you think you have to? Or is it because you know it's necessary in order to access certain protections or benefits? There's really no right answer. It's all about your specific needs and preferences. This is another situation where it's typically not all or nothing. When I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say you can always say more later, but you can never say less. If there is a need for you to divulge more information down the road, certainly be prepared to do so, but you don't have to offer it up right away. Seeing disclosure on a spectrum can really help you to make the decision of what, how much, and to whom you will be sharing this information. Finally, what do you know so far? When you're considering disclosure, it's important to share what you know to be true and not necessarily the what if. Getting accurate information from your healthcare provider around timelines and treatment protocols can be helpful, but you don't necessarily want to tell your employer that things are definitive because circumstances can always change. If you decide to disclose, let them know that what you're telling them today is what you know now, and that this can change, and if it does, you'll communicate that to them. Assuring your employer the dialogue will be kept open can really help ease some of their concerns about being kept in the loop. We actually held a webinar in April that takes a deeper dive into aspects of disclosure. So if you have any concerns about what to share or maybe what you've already shared, this can help you with some further considerations and next steps that you can take. So disclosure in the online space can have ramifications in the workplace. So we recommend developing a personal disclosure plan for your online presence. One step is to make clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're planning to share online and off. Where are you going to share it in terms of specific websites or blogs? And as you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. Now, it may be the case that some of you have disclosed at work and everyone's being really supportive, and that's an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is, the internet doesn't go away. So it really is important to think beyond right now and what's happening and to consider the possible long-term impact. Because as we know, none of us can predict the future. So you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now. Or your supportive boss may move on and be replaced by someone who's decided they want to start Googling their new staff. And frankly, there's really no way to know how that person is going to respond to the information that they find. So once you've made these decisions, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people you're connected to online. As I've unfortunately heard many stories from people who were accidentally outed by a well-intended loved one. And of course, even if you have shared your preferences with your loved ones, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you can have a better sense of what's out there. You may also want to consider your relationship to the larger cancer community. For example, if you volunteer with a cancer-related organization, while you may be okay with disclosing that you're a volunteer, you might not necessarily want to share that you're a survivor yourself, which is totally fine. You can still mention the affiliation. You just want to really give careful thought to the language that you use when referencing your involvement with them. So when it comes to disclosing at work, like all the rest of the decisions around sharing this news, it's incredibly personal and it requires a lot of thought. It's also another one where it's typically not all or nothing. And while we mentioned earlier that you're not required to share information about your health or health history, there can be situations where you find you might have to share information in order to access your rights under the law. So this doesn't mean sharing every last detail about your diagnosis or your prognosis. Rather, it means you might have to provide some support for why you're eligible to ask for whatever it is that you're asking for. So, for example, it would be difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they had no idea you had a condition to discriminate against. So, as you're thinking through whether to share or not, it's important to really consider all of these angles. And I do just want to point out that we have some resources on our website about disclosing and sharing the news at work. So when deciding whether or not to share information about your cancer status at work, there are two major questions that you should ask yourself. How will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And what legal benefits are there to sharing this information? It's important to note that people may want to disclose for a variety of reasons. Some people are sharers. They can't imagine going through such a big, life-changing event and not telling. But others feel very uncomfortable sharing personal information and are much more private. As I've mentioned, however you feel about sharing is valid and should be taken into account. The individual culture of a workplace can also play a role. Think about the various ways people communicate with each other at work can help you decide if, how, and how much you want to share that information. You may also think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. Now, you may not know of anyone who specifically went through cancer treatment, but maybe there's someone who went out on maternity leave, or is there a guy a few cubicles over who has an aging parent that he's caring for? Try to remember what kinds of flexibilities the workplace provided for them, if any, and how is the news received, both by managers and other members of the team? Were people willing to step up and pitch in, or was there silent grumbling about the extra work they were taking on? It can be incredibly valuable to consider these experiences as you begin to think about what you can expect out of your own experience as you share the information. We also get asked a lot, who should I tell? And that's going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. It's also possible that you may find yourself having to have more than one disclosure conversation. So if that's the case, we recommend starting with the person that is going to be easiest to talk to. For many, that's a direct supervisor or manager because that's someone with whom they can have an ongoing conversation with. And they could also potentially be an advocate for them with the higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers are not trained to be managers. So this may be the first time that they're having this type of conversation, and they might feel in pretty uncharted territory themselves. So unfortunately, it often puts the burden on the employee with cancer to help teach that manager what to do next. So Cancer and Careers has a manager's toolkit that we created because survivors asked us for something concrete that they could take with them into these conversations with their supervisor. And this allows them to outline what would be helpful and help make them feel supported. It can be a tool that's really useful, and I just want to point out that the link to that is at the bottom of this slide, and you can access it on our website. Now, for other people, their supervisor is just out of the question, so they might want to go to HR instead. Your HR department can be a font of information because they're the ones who understand that employee handbook we talked about, and they may even have experience with others who have been in similar circumstances and can provide some guidance. But perhaps the most important thing to disclose in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid, as I've mentioned numerous times so far, and helping them understand that the things that you're sharing are what you know today, but they may not apply next week or next month or even 6 months from now. And so this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation. And again, this is a way that they might feel a little bit more comfortable with the scenario. So you might face with some cancer-related comments when you're at work, and these comments can be addressed using a verbal technique that we call the SWIVEL. It's a verbal formula or pattern used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by a well-intended colleague. So here it involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's more work-oriented and appropriate. So we have some examples here. So someone comes up to you and says, you know, my uncle had cancer. You can respond and say, I'm so sorry to hear that. That must have been hard. And hey, while I have you, what did you think about the meeting that we had yesterday? Or another scenario, how are you feeling? Actually, a little confused by the time card system. Do you have a few minutes to explain again how it works? So being able to shift the conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be really empowering, and it indicates to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with lots of professional contributions to make. And while this might feel a little brash, it really can help you to regain control over your situation and make sure that you're only talking about things that you feel comfortable talking about. So as we move on with our conversation today, I do want to spend a little time talking about incorporating time off into your action plan. We talked earlier about the fact that deciding whether or not to work during treatment doesn't need to be an all or nothing proposition. And people may decide to take time off from work for a variety of reasons. Sometimes doing so is a choice that's made to help preserve energy levels or create some life balance. Other times, taking off is a necessity, such as to recover after surgery or if you need to spend time as an inpatient to receive particular types of treatment. One thing that's important to consider when incorporating your time off into your action plan is how long you anticipate being on leave for, as the length of time can influence the approach taken. Disclosure is a consideration if you decided to take time off as well. So perhaps you'd only like your direct supervisor and/or HR to know about your diagnosis. Others might want their coworkers to be aware of what's going on with them for a variety of reasons. So think about what you want to share and with whom as you prepare to take some time off. The Family and Medical Leave Act is a federal law that provides job protection when taking time off from work. And I'm going to provide some further details on the next slide, but it is something to keep in mind. And then you're going to want to spend some time thinking about what your specific leave plan might look like before having a conversation with your supervisor. This is a moment where using that information that you collected when you were getting yourself organized, as well as anything you've been tracking in your work diary, can help the conversation with your employer go a bit more smoothly. And I've also found that when you approach your manager or supervisor with specific ideas and solutions, they'll be much more open to working with you to figure out what's going to work best for everybody involved. So really preparing for these conversations can help you in the long run. So as I mentioned, the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, is a federal law that might provide protections when taking time off. This slide provides a high-level overview of the FMLA, as well as some resources where you can go for further information. It's important to note that this law does not automatically apply to everyone. The qualifications are listed on this slide. So if you're eligible, FMLA may provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, which can be used all at once or in increments as short as a few hours at a time. So if you wanted to use them for certain appointments and seeing your doctor, those can be a possibility. They can also provide health insurance protection while you're out on leave. So you can check your employee handbook or speak with your supervisor or HR department to find out whether FMLA is available to you and or if there are other leave policies available in your workplace. So a few recommendations for planning a leave of absence, whether it's short or long-term. So short-term leave, you want to identify a point person, someone you trust, someone who's willing to be a centralized source of information about you, your health, your schedule. This person can save you from having to constantly update everyone on how you're feeling, and can also be your go-to person to find out what's happening at the office if you have to be out. It's also important to understand your employer's rules about working or volunteering while you're on leave. For example, someone who checks their work email or attends a work event while on leave. How does that work into their plan? And then if you're taking longer leave, try to stay connected through LinkedIn or by joining trade associations and attending conferences if you're able. This can help you stay involved and kind of on top of industry trends and understanding where things are moving. To help offset gaps on a resume, you could think about consulting or volunteering or even refreshing skills or learning new ones. If attending a course or going back to school formally isn't an option or even appealing, there are now many courses that can be taken online, and many of them can be taken for free. So this is a really easy way to stay informed and can also be done from home. And I do want to point out that there are a lot more options now due to everything with COVID, online courses and low cost to free options for new learning opportunities. We also held a webinar this summer on enhancing skills and prepping for success. And this talks about just looking at the skills you hold and how to improve upon them or expand upon them. So now, just to recap, you should feel empowered to make decisions about work after cancer that align with what you want and what you need. So a cancer diagnosis does not mean you can no longer work if that's what you want to do. It's about finding ways to do so that work for you and for your treatment schedule. Now, also gathering information. What information you'll need and where to find it will help you to make informed decisions. Being prepared and having the right information and education and resources will really help you to make sure that you're able to make the most informed decision for yourself. And then getting organized. It can not only help you to make decisions about work after your cancer diagnosis, but it can help to maintain control over your life. And as we discussed, the ability to feel like you have control over your situation and your circumstances can really benefit you both mentally and physically. And then action planning. It's focused on what your needs are and how realistically they can be addressed. So planning will help to make the process around making these informed decisions much smoother. And then finally, disclosure is such an important piece of this puzzle when making decisions around work after a diagnosis and should be given the consideration necessary for you to feel comfortable. So I absolutely encourage you to utilize the resources that we have, view our recorded webinars, and certainly feel free to reach out to Cancer and Careers if this piece of the puzzle is causing you some stress and concerns. So that's it in terms of content for today, but I do just want to highlight really quickly some of the remaining events that we have for the year. We have 2 webinars remaining in our Balancing Work and Cancer series, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for one or both of them. I know that health insurance options is always a popular topic. Certainly, we plan it around November so that it's in time for open enrollment so you can best understand what your options are. And then Communicating Effectively is actually a new session that we're presenting this year, so we're pretty excited to share that content with you all. And then we also have our West Coast Conference coming up on next Saturday. This is the one that I mentioned is typically held in Los Angeles, but it will be held virtually this year. And registration is still open, so we'd love to have you join us. And then, as I mentioned, here are some legal resources you can use if you have specific questions about your own situation. I definitely encourage you to look into these and to contact those who might be appropriate if you are having concerns or questions. And even if nothing's come up yet, it's really good to just have some of this information and knowledge in your back pocket. And then I just wanted to provide you all with my contact information. So we are going to have plenty of time for questions today, but if we're not able to get to your question or if something comes up for you tomorrow, next week, in the next few months, you can feel free to reach out to me. And then I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. It has updates regarding our programs and services and anything else relevant to work in cancer. And I'm just going to leave this CEU requirements slide up for those of you who are interested in obtaining CEUs. And I will hand this back over to our operator, Jess, who can explain how Q&A is going to work. Jess?
Thank you, Nicole. The floor is now open for your questions. You may submit a question on the webinar by typing it in the question box located on the lower left-hand side of your screen. Or from the phone, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide the best sound quality. Again, ladies and gentlemen, *1 for any questions at this time.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have anything in the chat box. Jess, is there anyone on the phone?
I do not have any that have signaled so far.
Okay. Obviously, this is a lot of information to take in, so sometimes questions are a little hard to think of right off the bat unless you have a specific circumstance that this relates to. So certainly, as I mentioned, you can all feel free to reach out afterwards if anything comes up for you. But I will just give a little bit more time in case anybody has anything.
I do have one signal from the phone. We have a question from Ellen. Your line is open. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Ellen.
Okay, good. My question was something that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I got hacked into by my PayPal account got hacked into and got money taken out of my bank account. And it was really difficult to get some help, but finally, after about a week, they returned the money, PayPal.
Mm-hmm.
And now my bank, who had floated me the money to cover it, because I put a claim in, they put extra money in. So now I'm waiting for them to take their money back, and it's still even more confusing to give their money back. Do you have any hints about identity fraud, how you handle your money, anything like that to make, how to protect myself better? Or when those things happen, and it's very difficult to understand with chemo brain all the things, and of course I get stressed. So any tips about that, dealing with banks and money and fraud.
That's not really in our wheelhouse in terms of the information that we provide. I definitely hear you about needing to figure out how to kind of manage some things outside of work and in your personal life when you're dealing with chemo brain and things like that. I would recommend, getting a better understanding of what the requirements and commitment to your bank are, and maybe speaking with a representative there to understand, where they're coming from. And if you're still having any problems, I would probably recommend speaking with someone who's a little bit more legally focused, since I'm not totally sure about what your situation with the bank really is, and that's not really something that we deal with.
So no tips on how to protect yourself from fraud or anything like.
No, when we talk about thinking about your online presence, it's really in the context of your cancer diagnosis. Obviously, password protection and keeping up to date on protecting yourself in that respect is a good idea. But in terms of identity, I'm not too sure about that. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
And we do have another question signaled from Tish. Your line is open. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, Nicole. I am new to cancer and new to your organization too. My question is, do you guys have like a list of career coaches that we could access and, pay for, of course?
Yeah, so I would definitely encourage you to check out our Ask a Career Coach board. If there are specific questions that you have, that is a free service that we have available. And it's worth just also looking through some of the previously asked and answered questions, because sometimes your question might be answered from a previous individual who posed their situation. But in the event that you did want to go ahead and pay for one, we'd be happy to set you up with someone that might be appropriate. But I would definitely encourage you to utilize the free services first and see if that can meet some of your needs.
Okay, yeah, I did look at that earlier. Would I email you if I want to look at getting a career coach and paying for it?
Yeah, you can certainly reach out to me. I would recommend just emailing our general email. It's cancerandcareers@cew.org.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem.
And I do not have any other questions signaled.
Okay, it looks like we have a question in the Q&A box. This question comes from Rachel. I was just diagnosed last week, and I'm nervous to bring up the topic with my manager. Do you have any tips on how specifically to start the conversation? So this is obviously a very common concern among people who are newly diagnosed, or people who have been diagnosed for a while and have just decided that they'd like to disclose to their manager. Obviously, as has been the running theme in this presentation, preparation and gathering information that might be necessary is key. So I would recommend, thinking about what your needs are going to be, what exactly you want to tell your manager. Do you want to tell them specifically about your diagnosis? Do you want to tell them more information about what your treatment schedule is? Think about why you want to tell them. Does it have any benefits for you? Are you going to need access to certain things? Are you going to need time off? Are you going to need accommodations? So really thinking about why you want to tell them and why you should tell them. And then I always am a big proponent of practicing. So practicing conversations can be really, really helpful. So whether you want to do that with a family member or a social worker, or you can certainly give me a call, and I'd be happy to run through what a conversation like that could look like. You can feel free to do that as well. But again, really just preparing for that conversation, thinking about what your needs are going to be, and also, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about what the employer's needs are going to be. So trying to anticipate what their questions might be as well can help you to, be more prepared for that conversation and have answers ready instead of maybe scrambling and potentially telling them a little bit more than you had intended on. Okay. Is there anyone else on the line, Jeff?
I do not have any other questions signaled.
Okay. It looks like we have another one in the chat box. This comes from Stacy. I'm newly diagnosed and looking for work and have a job interview next week, my first one. Should I mention what's going on to the interviewer? Well, Stacy, first, I want to congratulate you on your job interview. That is very exciting. And this is another area where, the considerations around disclosure come into play. So I would pose to you why exactly you want to tell the interviewer and what that would do for you. So are you concerned that you're going to need time off for appointments, or do you have a schedule for your treatment already? But really, a lot of the time, especially when you're interviewing and looking for a job, you want to share information that's relevant based on where you are in the process. So personally, I wouldn't recommend sharing any of this information in a first job interview. What you really want them to do is be able to see who you are, what kind of information about you they should know, such as your experience, your skills, most importantly, your potential, and let them get to know you as a professional and as a job candidate first. And then as you move along in the process and you feel that they've gotten a better idea of who you are and what you represent, it can be a good idea if you feel that it's necessary for you to share, to then share. But again, I encourage you to wait as long as you can during that process, and you don't have to tell them at all, just remembering that it's a personal decision and that if you got the job and didn't tell them, that's not that you tricked them into hiring you, because at the end of the day, they hired you based on your skills and your potential. So again, really thinking through why you would want to tell them and what information is really relevant at this stage of the process. And again, thinking about what personal information you share in a job interview, even outside of the context of cancer. Most people are not going in and sharing everything about themselves. So you really just want to think about what exactly it is they need to know. Okay. So it does look like we do not have any further questions. I will hang on for another minute or two in case anybody has anything that pops up for them or even any scenarios they'd like to run by me. Otherwise, I do want to thank you all for attending today. I know that, again, this is a lot of information to take in, particularly if you are newly diagnosed and really trying to figure out your next steps. So certainly feel free to download the slides and go back to using them for reference later on as you are gathering information or action planning. Thank you again for coming today. I do want to also remind you that we will be sending the evaluation out tomorrow, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to fill it out so that we're able to continue to develop these programs to meet your needs based on any of the feedback that you give us. So again, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.